Hey everybody, welcome to Modern Day Debate. A few technical difficulties, but I guarantee this is going to be an epic debate because we have two very well-read gentlemen, guys that are both clear thinkers, as well as I mentioned, they've hit the books and they are ready to collide today in a really interesting question of whether or not Jesus fulfilled prophecy of the Old Testament, which for me, I have to say, I am honestly just very intrigued by this. I think that for a lot of people, there's something that it's like, yeah, that's this kind of clairvoyance. In other words, being able to tell the future. If the Old Testament authors were doing that, then that seems like compelling evidence, even for a naturalist, I would think. So with that, we don't want to waste any more time to get to this important question. Want to mention that both of the debaters' links will be in the description in just a moment as we have switched over to this new link. If you want to help us out, by the way, if you're watching right now, given our technical difficulties, we would be so honored if you'd be able to share this link, because I know that there might be a few people out there that wanted to watch this live and who haven't gotten yet. So if you want to either retweet or just share the link to people on Twitter, Facebook, whatever, we totally appreciate it. And thanks for being here. So want to say thanks to the debaters whose links, as I mentioned, are in the description box for you to check out. And first, we'll just start, given that Jim is on the left, we'll start going left to right. Jim, thanks so much for coming on. If you want to share what you've been up to as of late in terms of projects or YouTube or writing, reading, anything like that, we're glad to have you here. And what have you been up to?
Hi, James. Thanks for having me back, and good to see you again, Jonathan. Man, just been working hard on my new YouTube channel, Disciple of Kairos. Just getting some new content together. I've got about, I believe, 6 videos of content ready. Just need to do some editing and get an intro on and put it up. I don't have anything up on my channel yet, but it's coming soon. And other than that, it's just I'm just enjoying the rain that we're getting over here. But yeah, I'm happy to be here.
That's awesome. Where are you? Are you on the East Coast?
No, I'm smack dab between Mexico and Canada.
Wow, very nice. Oh, it's right. It is Texas.
Well, Oklahoma.
Oh, that's embarrassing. Okay, well, embarrassing for me for not remembering. So we're glad to have you here, Jim. And Jonathan, from across the pond, we're honored to have you. Thanks for being willing to do this late night debate, as it's a little bit later for you. And thanks for being here, Jonathan. And if you want to share what you've been up to in terms of projects, research, and what's been going on at the Apologetics Academy, we're thrilled to hear about it.
Oh, thanks so much. Yeah, I've been participating in debates and talks and writing, and recently, as you know, debated Jim, my opponent this evening, a few weeks ago on the topic of the resurrection, whether there is evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, and I'm delighted to be debating him this evening on this really interesting topic of messianic prophecy. I also did a debate between those two debates with a biblical Unitarian by the name of Carlos Xavier, which is available on my YouTube channel. We did a debate on the topic of, does the Old Testament teach the Trinity, which again is a really fascinating topic, which intersects a bit with the topic we'll be discussing this evening as well.
You bet. Absolutely. So, very excited. I'm going to get the clock started up. And for those of you tuning in, just want to let you know we'll have a more formal debate style. And I'm going to unpack that format as we go. But want to mention, if you have a question, feel free to shoot that into the live chat. And if you put an @ModernDayDebate, it's a little bit easier for me to spot it and then put it in our list. And if you have a super chat, that also allows you to make a comment during the question and answer. So it doesn't have to be a question in that case, to which one of the debaters can respond to, whoever you want it to be. And then all of the super chats just go automatically to the top of the list. So with that, I want to say thanks for being here. Oh, and by the way, if you're here for the first time, feel free to hit that subscribe button, as we are excited about a lot more debates coming up, including Inspiring Philosophy coming here tomorrow to debate a neo-pagan on whether or not Easter has pagan origins. So it'll definitely be interesting. Hope to see you there. And with that, given that we have the question of whether or not the Old Testament prophecy has been fulfilled by Jesus, Jonathan will be taking the affirmative. So naturally, we'll let Jonathan get the ball rolling. And so, Jonathan, I'm just going to start the clock for your 20-minute introduction. And you can just start speaking whenever you're ready. And that's when I'll technically start the actual timer.
Excellent. Can you see my screen already?
Give me 1 second to pull it up. I was looking at the timer on.
Can you see my screen?
Absolutely.
Yeah, great, excellent, wonderful. So let me just get started. You can start my timer. Hello and welcome. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you to Jim as well for participating in this debate. I'm really excited to engage on this very fascinating topic and delve into the question of whether Jesus fulfills messianic prophecy that we find scattered throughout the Old Testament. I'm convinced that the Old Testament is the New Testament concealed, and the New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. And I think that the Old Testament paints a tapestry, a jigsaw, if you will, which points to only one person, and that person is Jesus Christ. I think that the evidence is cumulative and it's overwhelming, and I can't wait to share some of that with you. Obviously, because of the constraints of time this evening, I can only do so much, and I can't do justice, unfortunately, to the topic. If you want more material and more content, I recommend checking out some of my other material. But for the purpose of this evening's debate, I'm just going to be focusing on just a narrow band of evidence relating to this topic. So let me just delve right in then. The purpose of the Old Testament, according to Jesus, is, and I'm quoting here from the Gospel of Luke, one of the four Gospels we find in the New Testament, Luke 24, verses 25 through 27. Jesus said to them, speaking to the disciples on the road to Emmaus, whom he meets after his resurrection, he says, "O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself." So the testimony of Jesus, and indeed the New Testament authors generally, is that the Old Testament is a witness to the messianic credentials of Jesus of Nazareth, and that the whole thing is basically about him. Indeed, all the scriptures concern the Messiah. And prophecy can really be thought of as being like a vessel waiting to be filled up with its contents. I mean, that's really the etymology, if you will, of the word fulfill. Fill is it's like a vessel waiting to be filled with its contents, and thus is the Old Testament. Now, I'm only going to be focusing primarily on one key text this evening. There's many texts we could discuss. I'm happy to go into any text that my opponent would care to bring up this evening. But for the purpose of my opening statement, I'm only going to be dealing with one key text, and that is my favorite text concerning the Messiah, which is Isaiah 53. It really begins in Isaiah 52, verse 13, and flows all the way through to Isaiah 53, verse 12. So I'm just going to read the text in its entirety because it's hard to do justice to it if people aren't acquainted with the text. So I'm just going to have to read the text, so bear with me, and then I'll dive into it. I'll perhaps comment and pause as I go as well. So, behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up and shall be exalted. As many were astonished at you, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind. So shall he sprinkle many nations. And of course, this conjures up the image of a priest, because the priest, part of his job, part of his duty would be to take the blood from the altar and sprinkle the mercy seat in the temple. And so Christ then is presented as a priest, consistent with other scriptures which present the Messiah as a priest. And as we continue reading, we'll find out that sacrifice that he's carrying, that he's bearing, is in fact himself, his own body, in fact. It says, "Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which they've not been told them they see, and that which they've not heard they understand. Who has believed what he has heard from us, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed." And so now we're beginning to see that the sacrifice that he's sprinkling the nations with as a high priest turns out to be his own body, right? He is his own sacrifice. Verse 6, "All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." So we've sinned, we've rebelled against a holy and just and righteous God, and God has placed the sins of the world upon this scapegoat, the Lord Jesus Christ, who has borne the sins, the penalty for sin, the judgment, the just indignation of a righteous God for sin in our stead, in our place. We continue reading verse 7. "He was oppressed and he was afflicted, Yet he opened not his mouth, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people? And they made his grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit found in his mouth. And so obviously he actually goes through death. He's actually cut off out of the land of the living, so he's dead now, and he's buried. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous. He shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many. He shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. And so, of course, we see that he actually comes back to life, because it says that that after the Lord has made, after his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring, or his seed. He shall prolong his days. And if my opponent wants this evening, we can get into what it means for Christ to have seed. But we continue on. There's a number of interpretations. The modern interpretation, and I emphasize this is a very modern interpretation, is that the among modern rabbis is that the text in Isaiah 53 concerns national Israel, and is actually a personification of national Israel. There's a number of problems with this. One is that if you look at verse 8 and 9, it says, by oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people? And they made his grave with the wicked, and with a rich man in his death, though he done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Now, in context, that my people of verse 8 is clearly the Hebrews. How then can national Israel be cut off out of the land of the living and stricken for the transgression of my people, Israel, if Israel herself has done no violence and there's been no deceit in her mouth? So that's a problem, I think. Moreover, Isaiah is quite explicit elsewhere, such as in Isaiah 6:5, where he exclaims concerning his own guilt before God. He says, woe is me, for I am lost. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. So clearly, I don't think the nation of Israel is in view as the righteous suffering servant in Isaiah 53. Isaiah 64:6 drives this point home further. We have all become like one who is unclean, and all our righteous deeds are like a polluted garment. We all fade like a leaf, and our iniquities, like the wind, take us away. A further reason, of course, to think that this text is not personifying the nation of Israel is that God uses the nations to smite Israel for Israel's sins. And Israel's smiting does not bring healing to the other nations. Rather, God then turns his hand in judgment against them for overdoing the punishment and for their haughtiness and arrogance. You can see this, for example, in Jeremiah 30, Jeremiah 31, Zechariah 1, Isaiah 10, Isaiah 29, etc. The nations of Babylon and Assyria, God then turns his hand in judgment upon them as well. So I think the nation of Israel doesn't quite fit the bill here. Another interpretation that's sometimes offered is that the Isaiah 53 concerns the righteous remnant within Israel. There's a number of problems with this. One is, of course, as I've just mentioned, that Isaiah in Isaiah 6 speaks of himself, in fact, as being a man of unclean lips. And it seems it seems unlikely that it's talking about the righteous remnant within Israel in Isaiah 53. Another objection to this is that Psalm 44 is, in fact, the prayer of the righteous remnant. Viewers can go read that for themselves. But even their sufferings as the righteous remnant of Israel did not bring healing to the nations. So that also militates, I think, against that interpretation. However, in a sense, the prophecy is about a righteous remnant, but it is a righteous remnant of one individual, namely Christ Jesus. And I'll go on to show that in just a moment. Now, so who then is the servant of Isaiah 53? We've ruled out a couple of possibilities, but who is the servant of Isaiah 53? Well, in 52:13 of Isaiah, the servant is described in the same language that Yahweh is described in Isaiah 6:1 and 33:5 and in 57:15. Isaiah 6:1, remember in Isaiah 52:13, it says that that he should be high and lifted up and should be exalted. Well, in Isaiah 6:1, it says, in the year King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord, that's Adonai, sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up. The same exaltation language is applied to him. We see this also in Isaiah 33, verses 5 and verse 10. The Lord is exalted, for he dwells on high. Verse 10, now I will arise, says the Lord. Now I will lift myself up. Now I will be exalted. Isaiah 57:15, for thus says the one who is high and lifted up, who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy, etc. So we can see this exaltation language that's applied to the Messiah and to the individual in Isaiah 53 is applied to Yahweh elsewhere in the book of Isaiah. In Isaiah 2, however, we read that it's Yahweh alone who will be exalted on the day of the Lord, and yet the servant shares in this status. So in Isaiah chapter 2, verses 11 to 17, we say that the haughty looks of man, speaking about the great and terrible day of the Lord, the haughty looks of man should be brought low, the lofty pride of man should be humbled, and the Lord alone will be exalted in that day. For the Lord of hosts is a day against all that is proud and lofty, against all that is lifted up, and it shall be brought low. Against all the cedars of Lebanon, lofty and lifted up, and against all the oaks of Bashan, against all the lofty mountains, against all the uplifted hills, against every high tower, against every fortified wall, against all the ships of Tarshish, against all the beautiful craft, and the haughtiness of man should be humbled, the lofty pride of men should be brought low, and the Lord alone will be exalted in that day. And so, my dear friends, I ask, if Yahweh alone is to be exalted on the day of the Lord, and yet the servant is to be exalted, who does that make the servant by implication? It makes him the God of Israel. It makes him Yahweh. And we can get into that in more detail, that argument in more detail if we need to later on. But there's more reasons, in fact, to think that the servant of Isaiah 53 is, in fact, a divine person himself. For example, Isaiah 45 says that Israel will be justified in Yahweh alone. It says, only in the Lord it shall be said of me, are righteousness and strength. To him shall come and be ashamed all who are incensed against him. In the Lord, all the offspring of Israel shall be justified and shall glory. Moreover, in Isaiah 59:16, we read that no one is worthy enough to intercede. In fact, Yahweh looks around and he sees that there was no man, and wondered that there was no one to intercede. There's no one worthy enough to intercede for mankind. Then his own arm brought him salvation, and his righteousness upheld him. So God has to do it himself, because only God is worthy to bring about intercession. And yet in Isaiah 53, verses 11 and 12, it says that the servant will justify the many and make intercession for sinners. And so again, if only Yahweh is worthy to make intercession and to bring about justification, and yet the servant does it, then who does that make the servant by implication? It makes him Yahweh, the God of Israel. There's another argument, though, that Isaiah 53 is the follow-on from a thread running throughout the book of Isaiah, the previous through a number of texts concerning the Messiah. The previous one, an earlier one, is in Isaiah 49, where it says, listen to me, O coastlands, and give attention, you peoples from afar. The Lord called me from the womb. From the body of my mother he named my name. He made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand he hid me. He made me a polished arrow. In his quiver he hid me away. And he said to me, you are my servant. It's the same expression, of course, used in Isaiah 52:13. You are my servant Israel, in whom I will be glorified. But I said, I have labored in vain. I have spent my strength for nothing in vanity. Yet surely my right is with the Lord, and my recompense with my God. And now the Lord says, he who formed me from the womb to be a servant, to bring Jacob back to him, that Israel might be gathered to him. So notice that this individual is called Israel, and yet he redeems and regathers national Israel. And so that's very significant. It provides a lot of the backstory, the backdrop to the New Testament's representation of Jesus as the greater Israel. Explains, for example, why Hosea 11:1 is quoted and applied to Jesus, which says, I've called my son out of Egypt, speaking, of course, of Israel, but Jesus being the greater Israel, certain texts concerning Israel are applied to him in the New Testament. So we continue. For I'm honored in the eyes of the Lord, and my God has become my strength. He says, it is too light a thing that you should be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob, to bring back the preserved of Israel. I will make you as a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. And so, very consistent with what we see in Isaiah 53 about Isaiah 52 about him being sprinkling the nations, sprinkling the nations. We continue in verse 7. Thus says the Lord, the Redeemer of Israel, and his Holy One, to one deeply despised, abhorred by the nation. Again, very similar to the description in Isaiah 52, 13 through 15, and following into 53. To one deeply despised, abhorred by the nation, the servant of rulers, kings shall see and arise, princes, and they shall prostrate themselves. Very similar to the kings being speechless in Isaiah 52 as well. Because of the Lord who is faithful, the Holy One of Israel who has chosen you. And so I think that this servant is very clearly the same individual as spoken of in Isaiah 53. And in Isaiah 42, we see the same servant spoken of again earlier in Isaiah. Here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. He will not shout or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged till he establishes justice on earth. And so part of the job description of the Messiah is to bring justice to the earth, worldwide peace, worldwide justice, very similar to the description given in Isaiah 49. He will not falter or be discouraged till he establishes justice on earth. In his teaching, the islands will put their hope. This is what God the Lord says, the creator of the heavens, who stretches them out, who spreads out the earth with all that springs from it, who gives breath to its people and life to those who walk on it. I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you and will make you to be a covenant of the people and a light for the Gentiles. Very similar description given as in Isaiah 49 about being light for the Gentiles. To open eyes that are blind, to free captives from prison, to release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness. So we can see, I think, that the same individual spoken of in Isaiah 53 is spoken of in Isaiah 49 and 42. In Isaiah 11, we see the same servant presented to us. It says, a shoot will come from the stump of Jesse, from his roots. And the singular form of that word that is actually sheresh, the same word used in Isaiah 53, a root out of dry ground. A branch from his roots, a branch will bear fruit. And so he's to be of a descendant of Jesse. The imagery of the stump of Jesse suggests that the Davidic dynasty has faded away into obscurity, and from that stump of Jesse comes, and Jesse is used, of course, because I would argue it's the house of David as though it was in the days of Jesse, before it's prospered greatly under David. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit. So he's a descendant of David. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him. The very same description that we just saw in Isaiah 42 concerning the servant, about the Spirit of the Lord resting on him. The Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. He will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes, or decide by what he hears with his ears. But with righteousness he will judge the needy. With justice he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. So we can see, like Justin, as we saw in the other text we looked at, part of the job description is to establish worldwide justice. So it's the same individual. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth. With the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. Righteousness will be his belt, and faithfulness the sash around his waist. Verse 10. In that day the root, again sheresh, the same word used in Isaiah 53, of Jesse will stand as a banner for the peoples. The nations will rally to him. Remember him being a light to the Gentiles we saw elsewhere. And his resting place will be glorious. In Isaiah 9, again, we see the same individual presented to us. Verse 1. But there will be no gloom for her who is in anguish. In the former time he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land of beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. Again, him being a light for the Gentiles, very consistent with what we see here. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in the land of deep darkness, on them as light shone. Very similar to imagery we saw later on in Isaiah, about him setting captives free and those who sit in darkness. In verse 6, for to us a child is born, to us a son is given. The government should be upon his shoulder, and his name should be called Wonderful Counselor, El Gabor, or Mighty God. This individual is actually identified as the Mighty God, a title applied in the very next chapter, Isaiah 10:21, to Yahweh. This individual is Yahweh. An everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. On the throne of David, so again, very consistent with Isaiah 11 and being of a descendant of Jesse and David, and over his kingdom to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. So again, as we saw in these other texts, part of his job description as Messiah is to establish worldwide justice. So we can see it's the same individual all the way through. And yet this individual in verse 6 of Isaiah 9 is identified as the mighty God, showing us this individual is in fact himself a divine person. Then finally, we look at Zechariah 9, and we see a description of the same individual that we see in Isaiah. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. Righteous and having salvation is he. Humble and mounted on a donkey, on the colt the foal of a donkey. I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem. The battle bow shall be cut off. He shall speak peace to the nations. His rule shall be from sea to sea. Very similar description to what we see in Isaiah. From the river to the ends of the earth. As for you also, because of the blood of my covenant with you, the blood of Christ's covenant, I would argue, we can talk about that later, I will set your prisoners free from the waterless pit. Very similar description to what we saw in Isaiah. And yet in chapter 14, verse 9, when it speaks about the great day of the Lord, when the Lord comes to deliver Israel from her enemies, verse 9, it says, on that day, the Lord will be king over all the earth. On that day, the Lord will be one, and his name one. So the Messiah is said to be king over all the earth, and yet Yahweh is said to be king over all the earth, showing us that this is, in fact, a divine person himself. And so I'm just going to conclude with this text from Matthew 5, verses 17 and 18, the words of Jesus himself. He says, "Do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not a iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished." And I will finish with that. Thanks for your attention.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Totally appreciated, Jonathan. And thanks so much for everybody's discussion in the live chat, letting you know if you have a question, feel free to just put an @ModernDayDebate. We will put it in the pile for question and answer time. And we are thrilled to have Jim Majors present as well. So Jim, I will start the timer on your first word. And then after this 20-minute opening from Jim, we will go into 10-minute rebuttals. So Jim, on your first word.
All right, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good deal. So the question of the night, is Jesus the Messiah of the Old Testament? No. The Old Testament does not speak of Jesus. Not at all. Doesn't mention him once. He's a very naughty boy, but he's not the Messiah. How can this be, you ask? There are so many alleged prophecies. So for the purpose of the debate, I guess we'll see what Old Testament, quote unquote, prophecies the New Testament claims to fulfill. Let's get into that. The Messiah prophesied by the Old Testament was to be a priest, much like Jonathan just said. And he completely agrees with me there. Numbers 2, verse 5 through 10, says that they'll be of the tribe of Levi, that those will be the priests. That nobody else will be allowed in there. Anyone else who approaches the sanctuary is to be put to death. Numbers 2:10. Deuteronomy 18, 17 through 19. The Lord says, what they say is good. I will raise up from them a prophet like you from among their fellow Israelites, and I will put my words in his mouth. He will tell them everything I command him. I myself will call to account anyone who does not listen to my words that the prophet speaks in my name. And much like Jonathan said in Isaiah 53 with the sprinkling of water, it did say that Jesus was a priest. But Jesus is not a high priest, nor is he from the tribe of Levi. The Messiah prophesied was to be the Mashiach, the Messiah, the anointed one. He was never supposed to die. See, many claim that the suffering servant in Isaiah is Jesus. Jesus is not who Isaiah was referring to. Isaiah says nothing about God taking on human form, being born of a virgin, etc. Jesus didn't redeem Israel. Jews have been persecuted for over 2,000 years. I'd also like to point out another claim. In Isaiah 66, verse 23, Isaiah seems to claim that all flesh would come and worship before God. The fact that I'm here today debating this defeats that claim. In Luke 3, John the Baptist quotes Isaiah saying, as it is written in the book of the, hang on, sorry. In Luke 3, John the Baptist quotes Isaiah saying, as it is written in the book of the words of Isaiah the prophet, a voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him. Every valley shall be filled in, every mountain and hill made low. The crooked roads shall become straight, the rough ways smooth, and all people will see God's salvation. But the problem here is with that last verse. All people will see God's salvation. Again, I'm here. And in Isaiah, it says that he will gather the people of all nations. There are many more instances in Isaiah that prove that Jesus is not the Messiah that Isaiah is referencing. A favorite of apologists is Isaiah 53. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He hath put him to grief. When thou shalt make a soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed, he shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. In verse 10, it says the suffering servant will see his seed, his offspring. We see it used elsewhere in the Old Testament under the exact same conditions. It says he would have his days prolonged. Jesus had no children, no seed, no offspring. I mean, maybe in the secret gospel of Mark, but not in anything canonical. Jesus died at a fairly young age, even for that time. He died at my age. I would hardly call that prolonged. One of the alleged prophecies of Jesus is the claim that Jesus was born of a virgin, as read in Isaiah 7:11, as read in the Greek mistranslation of the original Hebrew. The author of Matthew likely uses Septuagint as his source for referencing his prophetic fulfillments. Here, Isaiah promises Ahaz that God will destroy his enemies and tells him to ask God for a sign that this is a true prophecy, to give him a sign that would confirm that what Isaiah was promising was true. The sign was to be the birth of a son to an Almah, meaning a woman who had not yet had a child but was of childbearing or marrying age. And she is to name the boy Emmanuel, and in some cases it's kind of up in the air as to what the translation is, but in some cases this woman has already conceived. It can be a talking about current tense, present tense, so that she is to name the boy Emmanuel, meaning God is with us, and God will destroy Ahaz's enemies before the child reaches the age where he's able to tell right from wrong, eating of curds and honey. The mistranslation here, presuming Isaiah to be prophesying the virgin birth, it's been used by apologists to claim the fulfillment of the Emmanuel prophecy, basically signing God's name on the birth certificate. Jesus's triumphant entry into Jerusalem, Jonathan kind of touched on that. Originally in Zechariah 9:9, Mark 11:1-10 retells it to the audience as if it's a fulfillment of a prophecy. I only included verses 7-9, but you can read 1-10, and that provides the full context. I just didn't have room for it on the PowerPoint. But Mark seems to be using the original Hebrew instead of the Septuagint, and if he did use the Septuagint, he had enough sense to see it for what it was, which we'll be going over now. In Matthew's account, Jesus not only rode the colt mentioned in Zechariah 9:9, but he also rode the colt's mother at the same time. It would seem that the author of Matthew was not familiar with synonymous parallelism, which is it's a poetic literary device that we see used often in the Hebrew Bible, which basically takes one thing and then retells it in another way, just using different words. But Matthew is too concerned with the prophecy. Matthew leads the reader to believe that Jesus' triumphant entry looked something like this. Shame on you, Matthew. Shame on you. I mean, maybe Jesus did do that. That's kind of cool. I come to not bring peace, but a sword. Sorry. The author of Matthew attempts to draw a parallel between Moses and Jesus multiple times. In the genealogy, Matthew introduces Jacob as the father of Joseph, and much like the Old Testament Joseph, Jesus' father is associated with dreams, having revelations from angels foretelling the virgin birth and the danger from Herod. Here we have Matthew 2:13, the escape to Egypt, when the angel appears to the Lord in a dream and says, "Get up," and basically warning them of Herod's plan. We see in Matthew 2:19-20 the return to Nazareth. An angel again appears to him in a dream and says, "Hey, you can come back from Egypt now. It's safe. Everything's good. Herod's dead." Matthew 2:22. He hears that Archelaus is reigning in Judea in place of Herod, and so he's afraid to go there. So instead, he goes to Galilee. Again, some retrofitting of the prophecy there. He's basically retrofitting to what the author supposed to be a prophecy in Hosea. Out of Egypt, I called my son. But he doesn't give the full verse there. The full verse in its context, it's talking about the people of Egypt being exiled out of Egypt. King Herod also has parallels to the Old Testament. Refers to the slaughter of the innocents, the infants that are less than 2 years old, and then you have that also in the Old Testament where the Pharaoh does the same thing. Luke, however, has a completely different take. In that genealogy, Heli is the father of Joseph. Luke also seems to be obsessed with 77. He makes a real effort to remove and add people to the genealogy in order to be able to split it into 3, kind of retrofitting another prophecy. You have Abraham and David, and then Jesus is supposed to be the end of the third rotation. So 7 was a number that was seen as a holy number. Matthew's also fascinated with the number 7, but he takes his genealogical prophecy a different route. Beside that, just to further prove that each had their own agenda, the parallels of the New Testament Joseph to the Old Testament, the New Testament Joseph to the Old Testament Joseph in Matthew, they're completely absent in Luke. So Luke doesn't have any of that stuff. Real quick, Matthew 1:17. Dang it, sorry. Thus there were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile to Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah. So he's basically saying, hey, look what I did. So we can tell it. Luke obviously didn't read Matthew. So no Egypt. They didn't go to Egypt. They go back to Jerusalem, no problem. This is in Luke. So remember in Matthew, Joseph had an angel appear to him in a dream and warn him, and they fled into Egypt, and they stayed until Herod died, and then out of Egypt did I call my son, dun, da, da, da. But there's no warning of danger in a dream, and they don't wait long to return either. In fact, they circumcise Jesus at 8 days old, and they take Jesus right up to the temple to perform his rites of purification at 32 days old, which was Jewish tradition. So Jesus is coming back soon. Another prophecy, Mark 13:30. Truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Talking about fulfilling the prophecies of the Messiah. Let's see. So, what and when were the last days? In the book of Acts, chapter 2, verses 14 through 18, after speaking in tongues on the day of Pentecost, Peter tells the crowd and the 11 that they are living in the last days, saying that the gift of tongues was fulfillment of Joel 2:28, which said that in the last days the gift of prophecy would return to the people of Israel. Quoting it here, in the last days God says, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy, your young men will see visions, your old men will dream dreams. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my spirit in those days, and they will prophesy. So I don't know if Jews have superpowers or not, but I guess according to this, they do. So a few more goodies, just some unfulfilled prophecies of Jesus. Isaiah 2:4 says that the Messiah would bring world peace, and people would turn their swords into plowshares, and so on and so forth. That there would be a rebuilding the temple after the destruction, John 2:19. And in John 2:19, this is right after Jesus had finished cleaning the temple of all the people who he had thought defiled it. And he's telling them that he will tear the temple down and rebuild it in 3 days. And some people like to say that this is Jesus saying that he's talking about his own body. But I mean, if you look at it in context, they're literally standing either in or in front of the temple, and Jesus had just done this. This is immediately after it. So Jesus is clearly talking about that. So any attempt to conflate the two is I think personally dishonest. And Jeremiah 15:20, there's no iniquity found in the people of Israel. Basically saying that there's what it's saying in Jeremiah 15:20 is God looked into the hearts of the children of Israel, and he saw no iniquity, he saw no sin. So basically saying that they're sinless in the last days. And in the telling of from Peter on the day of Pentecost, I mean, that's a real clear what would you call it? It's a real clear shoot. It just kind of really clears things up, because it says that these are the last days, because he considered that as a sign of last days, and he said, you know, that they are truly living there, saying that the gift of tongues was fulfillment of Joel 28. Before I end here, I would like to say this one. It's Deuteronomy 18 verses 21 through 22. You may say to yourselves, how can we know when a message has not been spoken by the Lord? This was asked. This is the answer. If what a prophet proclaims in the name of the Lord does not take place or come true, that is a message the Lord has not spoken. That prophet has spoken presumptuously, so do not be alarmed. This is Deuteronomy 18 verses 21 through 22. So I think that I've demonstrated here that what this prophet proclaims to be true has not come true. Therefore, even by a Christian standards, this is a message that the Lord has not spoken. And I'm talking about Isaiah. I'm talking about the author of Deuteronomy. I'm talking about the author of Genesis. I'm talking about the author of Isaiah and Deutero-Isaiah. I'm talking about the author of the New Testament Gospels, the author of Acts, the author of the Pauline epistles. I believe that all of those who have spoken or claimed to have prophecy that has not been fulfilled is a false prophet by anybody's standards. With that, shameless plug, disciple of Kairos, and follow me on Twitter at the Jim Majors. And with that, I conclude my presentation and I surrender the rest of my time to the discussion.
You bet. Well, thank you very much for that opening statement. And we will next move into the rebuttal session. So we will have 10-minute rebuttals, and I am starting the clock, or I should say setting it up. And on your first word, Jonathan, I will start the timer. Oh, I think, forgive me. Oh, sorry about that, Jonathan.
Sorry,
okay, so sorry about that, Jonathan. I'll let you start over. I had you on mute. I forgot that I put you on mute. Okay, Jonathan, the floor is yours. Thanks for your patience, and I'll start the timer on your first word.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Jim, so much for your spirited engagement. There was a number of very ill-informed statements, unfortunately, in the presentation. And I just want to address these insofar as I have time to do so in my rebuttal here. You mentioned in Matthew 21, for example, that Jesus wrote the colt's mother, and he actually writes two animals, and he's evidently taking a very literal reading of Zechariah 9. It's a very popular argument. Rabbi Tovia Singer, Jesus' argument, or Ehrman in his book Jesus Interrupted, is Jesus' argument, but it's an atrocious argument. It's actually very, very ill-informed, and I'll explain why. Let's look at the text. Matthew 21. Verse 6 and 7. The disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and put on them their cloaks, and he sat on them. Namely, he sat on the cloaks, not the two animals. Do you really think that Matthew thought that Jesus was sitting on two animals riding into Jerusalem? He sat on the cloaks that were placed on the animal. So I think that's just a very naive reading of that particular text. You pointed out the Messiah was prophesied to be a priest in the Old Testament. Absolutely, he was, and Jesus was and is a priest. That's part of his job description. Psalm 110 speaks about him being a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. He's both a priest and king. He ever lives to intercede for us and to present his sacrifice as a perpetual sacrifice to the Father, as the once for all completed sacrifice. On our behalf. So he serves as our mediator or great high priest. He is a king, a priest after the order of Melchizedek, as per Psalm 110. And there's other texts that deal with the priestly role of the Messiah in the Old Testament as well, such as in Zechariah 6 and so forth. In Isaiah 52 as well, it also touches on this. So yes, I completely agree. The Messiah was supposed to be was predicted to be a priest, and he is a priest in the sense that he makes intercession for us before the Father and serves as our great mediator. He says that the Messiah was never supposed to die, and he mentioned also in Isaiah 53 about his days being prolonged, and he mentioned that Jesus died at a young age, and so how can his days be prolonged? Yes, his days are prolonged through resurrection, as I explained in my opening statement. If you read the text of Isaiah 53, it's very clear he's cut off from the land of the living. He's dead. Then he's buried, just to emphasize he's dead now. He's cut off from the land of the living, no longer alive, and then his days are prolonged. So he's resurrected, he's raised from the dead, and he lives forever embodied. He retains his body for forever from now on. And so I don't see exactly what his point is with that. He said in Isaiah 66:23, we read that all flesh would come and worship God. And this also relates to when he mentioned Isaiah 2 verse 4, which says the Messiah would bring world peace and people would beat their plows into plowshares. Absolutely. But this is still future. Some of the prophecies concerning the Messiah are short term and happen in or happen during the first advent of Christ when he first comes. And some are still future. Some refer to the future and are not yet fulfilled at this point. And so the Messiah in his second coming will establish world peace. He mentioned John 2:18 and 19, when Jesus is approached by the Jews and asked what miraculous sign we show us to prove your authority to do these things after we just cleansed the temple. And he says, we'll destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. And he mentioned this is a failed prophecy because the temple was never rebuilt after 3 days. It was destroyed, of course, by the Romans in AD 70. This is completely misreading this text. In John 2, he's talking about his resurrection, and that's actually brought out very clearly by the author. Let me read it right here. So the author of John's Gospel notes that in verse 18, it says, he said, destroy this temple, in 3 days I'll raise it up. Verse 19. Verse 20, the Jews then said, it's taken us 46 years to build this temple, and he will raise it up in 3 days. But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. If you look at various sayings throughout all 4 Gospels, Jesus over and over again speaks about his resurrection from the dead, that he will suffer, he'll be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, he'll be crucified, killed, and then on the 3rd day, he will be raised from the dead. And so it sits very neatly within that context. It's very clearly, I think, what Jesus is alluding to, and it sits very nicely in the context of other things Jesus has said, especially when he uses that construction about the three days or on the 3rd day. He mentioned Mark 13:30. This generation will not pass away until all these things have happened. This again is just reading this completely out of context. Let me just quickly pull this up for you. Mark 13 and verse 30. Okay, here we go. It says, so if you look at the lead up to that, he's talking about the signs that you expect to see when the Messiah is coming, and he speaks about things not to get alarmed by. He says in verse 6, men will come in my name saying I am he, and they will lead many astray. When you hear wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. So don't be alarmed by these earthquakes and rumors of wars and so on. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There'll be earthquakes in various places. There'll be famines, but these are about the beginning of birth pains. So these are not things to be alarmed about. And he goes on, and he talks about things that are to happen. So he's basically preparing the disciples for a long wait for his second coming. And then he describes the signs that are to be expected when he is about to come to the end of the age. And he says, from the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. Verse 29, so also when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly, I say to you, this generation, namely the generation that sees these things, will not pass away until all these things take place. So I think, again, Jim unfortunately demonstrates an eisegesis of that text and is not reading it contextually. He mentioned, that Jesus had no children in the context of Isaiah 53. On that point, that again I think is an ill-informed argument for the reason that text here is Isaiah 53. So in Isaiah 53, it uses the Hebrew word zera for seed, which almost refers to, and the argument that's often made, it's made by Jewish apologists, for example, it's made by Muslim apologists sometimes, that it always refers to literal physical offspring or progeny. In fact, my opponent this evening made that argument. But the expression Yara Zera, which means seed, is only used one time in the Hebrew Bible, and it's right here. So one can hardly be dogmatic as to its meaning. And in fact, in any case, the word zera is used figuratively at times in the Hebrew scriptures, even including in the book of Isaiah. For example, Isaiah referred to Israel as a seed of evildoers in chapter 1, verse 4, a seed of an adulterer in chapter 14, verse 20, and a seed of falsehood in chapter 57, verses 3 and 4. Thus, in those texts, the term seed or offspring refers to one who is to the core an evildoer or an adulterer, etc. In like manner, in Isaiah 53:10, It refers to the fact that the suffering servant would see his disciples transformed by virtue of his work on their behalf. This is related in Isaiah 53 to the prolonging of his days, which alludes to his resurrection from the dead, of course. And significantly, actually, Isaiah 9:6 identifies the Messiah as everlasting Father, which I think connects with that as well. So that's what I have to say on that point. He mentioned, that he mentioned Hosea 11:1, and Matthew doesn't quote the context. Out of Egypt I call my son. There's a lot to say on this, and I don't have time to say, but just very briefly, I mentioned in my opening statement Isaiah 49. Actually, Isaiah 42 contrasts the righteous servant, the Messiah, and the unrighteous servant of Israel. If you look at the two halves of Isaiah 42, Isaiah 49 actually identifies the Messiah by the name Israel. And then it's the singular individual Israel who then redeems and regathers national Israel. There's also connections to the book of Numbers, and in particular the oracles of Balaam in chapter, I think it's 24 and 25, if I'm not mistaken. And basically the Messiah that's prophesied is spoken of in the very same terms as Israel. And so there's a lot of backstory as to why Matthew draws a lot of texts that are concerning Israel and applies them to the Messiah. He mentioned Isaiah 7:14, and the fact that Alma, which is the word used there, is translated by the Septuagint as virgin, but doesn't mean virgin. The word that used for virgin is often said is Betula. Actually, Alma, in the 7 times it's used in the Old Testament, does seem to mean virgin. Genesis 24:43, for example, where the word refers to the virgin Rebecca. Exodus 2 verse 8, where the word refers to Moses' sister Miriam, who would question that she was a virgin at the time Moses was born. So that's all I have time for because I'm out of time, but I look forward to hearing Jim's engagement with my opening statement when we get to his rebuttal. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks so much. All right, we will now move to the rebuttal from Jim Majors. And with that, just a reminder, if you have any questions out there, feel free to shoot them into the live chat. And with that, I will start the timer on your first word, Jim.
Well, my electricity is flickering, so I hope my my power doesn't go out. Okay, let's see here. I guess I'll start with this. Okay, so I just want to talk about this for a second. It says the disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and put on them, plural, put on both of them, their cloaks, and he sat on them. So I mean, it's not clarifying here, but the fact of the matter is that if we go back just one, we see that in Zechariah it's using this synonymous parallelism, this literary device to describe this colt twice. On a donkey, a colt, the foal of a donkey. But Mark doesn't seem to have a problem with this. He says, and many spread their, he said, and they brought the colt to Jesus. And if you read earlier in Mark, from Mark 11:1, you can see that they actually go and get both the mother and the colt, which in Matthew, and in Mark, they only get the colt. It doesn't, they do not get the mother. They do not ask for the mother. They just specifically get the colts. Let's see what else. Next, I want to get out of here for sure. And I want to, all right, let's do this. Truly, I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming into his kingdom. Sorry, I just had to pull it up. That's not usually what I use, but here it's not preparing the apostles, it's preparing his followers. Okay, so what's going on right now at this time? There's a big revolt going on. There's a lot of tension between the Jews and the Romans. I mean, it's debatable whether there's already been the first revolt, but there's most certainly tension. People are dying. People are being persecuted for sure. So this is an attempt to build confidence within the followers. And it's the same thing with saying that Jesus will tear down this temple and build it back up, and then saying that, oh, well, he was talking about his body and saying it after the fact. This isn't Jesus saying this. This is the apostles explaining it after the fact. As a matter of fact, much of it is the apostles explaining things after the fact. Let's see. Jonathan 1:19 through 25. And this is a testimony of John when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, "Who are you?" He confessed and did not deny, but confessed, "I am not the Christ." So we know he's not the Christ. And then they asked him, they said, "What then? Are you Elijah?" He said, "I am not." So he's not Elijah. He's not Christ. He's not Elijah. They asked him, "Are you the prophet?" And he answered, "No." So he said, "Well, who are you?" So they asked him 3 different questions to get 3 different no's. Why? Because they are 3 different people. They are 3 different prophecies. The Christ, the Messiah, Christus, Mashiach, whatever you want to call him, is one prophecy. Elijah, the second Elijah, is another. John the Baptist is said to be the second Elijah. Are you the prophet? He answered no. Muslims use this to justify their prophet. They very rarely like to cherry pick from the New Testament, but this is one of the cases that they certainly do. And if you go to John 7, verse 40 through 52, it says, on hearing his words, some of the people said, "Surely this man is the prophet." Others said, "He is the Messiah." So here we have people arguing. We have Jewish leaders arguing. Still others ask, "How can the Messiah come from Galilee? Does not Scripture say that the Messiah will come from David's descendants and from Bethlehem, the town where David lived?" Thus the people were divided because of Jesus. Some wanted to seize him, but no one lay a hand on him. So they just kind of wanted to sit back and see what he was doing. But they were debating who he was. Was he Elijah? Was he the Messiah? I mean, was he the Christ? I'm sorry, was he the prophet? Finally, the temple guards went back to the chief priests and the Pharisees, who asked them, "Why didn't you bring him in?" The guards replied, "No one ever spoke the way this man does." The Pharisees said, "You mean he's deceived you also? Have any of the rulers or of the Pharisees believed in him?" "No, but this mob that knows nothing of the law, there's a curse on them." And Nicodemus, who had gone to Jesus earlier and who was one of their own number, asked, "Does our law condemn a man without first hearing him to find out what he has been doing?" They replied, "Are you from Galilee too? Look into it, and you will find that a prophet does not come out of Galilee." Let's see, what else can I touch on? We can go back to Alma. I believe that was the last thing that you had said. And yes, he is right. The correct Hebrew word there is betula. But the Greek authors of the Septuagint, who were translating the Hebrew Bible into Greek for the Hellenized area, they mistranslated it. Either way you want to look at it, they used the Greek word parthenos, which is most certainly means virgin. Now, they could have done this for one of 2 reasons. It wasn't necessary for Jesus to be born of a virgin. The Greek word does not specify virgin. If the prophecy wanted it to be born of a virgin, it would have used betula. It would have used the more accurate nomenclature. That's just, I mean, it's just common sense, especially something so important as a prophecy. And then the fact that Mark doesn't mention it at all kind of says something. So, but that's neither here nor there. Yeah, so since it's not necessary for Jesus to be born of a virgin, then there's a lot of retrofitting going on there, and even more so with Matthew, because Matthew, says a lot of things that he's having to refer to the Old Testament, and he's messing up. He's making all these claims about Jesus, and he was the only author of the Gospels that was a supposed eyewitness of Jesus. Of his accounts, like of one of his followers, the only one. His accounts are the most ambiguous and the most questionable and the most strange and the most contradictory. Can't get anything right. Can't get the Sermon on the Mount right. Can't get the Beatitudes right. Can't get the virgin birthright, can't get how many donkeys were given here. The prophecy, it doesn't say anything about 2 donkeys. The prophecy was riding a colt. So any attempt to apologize for Matthew the author of Matthew having them take both of them and putting cloaks on both of them and riding one or the other, blah blah blah. The fact of the matter is, it was a Sabbath walk. A Sabbath walk was a very short, it's like a half a mile, I think, maybe less than a half a mile. But it's the distance that they could walk on the Sabbath outside of the city walls. They weren't allowed to travel any farther than that. In fact, people would have to stop and camp for the night for going any further. So it's not like he needed 2 donkeys or anything. So there's no reason to put 2 donkeys in there other than the fact that Jesus's follower Matthew use this prophecy to explain something that he should have seen for himself. So either Mark, well, we know that Mark didn't get it from him. Mark was written before him. So I mean, either Mark got it wrong, but still kind of right, or Matthew just doesn't know what he's talking about. How much time do I have left, James?
Sorry about that. It was on mute. You have 1 minute left.
Oh, okay. I think that's good enough.
You got it. Well, thank you very much. So we will now move into the next phase, and this is 6-minute cross-examination. So this is going to be very exciting, as this is where the debaters can really kind of prod at each other's arguments. And with that, given that we had Jonathan start, we will continue to alternate. And so Jonathan will have the first 6 minutes to ask questions to Jim. So,
all right.
Go ahead.
Well, thank you. Just a quick question concerning, you brought up Matthew 21 again, and the allegation that Jesus sat on 2 animals according to Matthew's gospel. Do you think it's perfectly natural that the mother donkey would have been brought along as an unbroken colt would require the mother's presence to keep it calm through the shouting crowds? Is that not plausible historically?
No, absolutely not. You have to wean a colt. I own a horse sanctuary, and whenever you have animals like that, when they get to a certain age, you have to wean them in order to break them. You can't break them with the mother present. After a while, they lose their dependency. So in order for Jesus to even sit on it, I mean, that's what they call green broke, is what you would call that, where it needs another animal to lead it. Now, it could need its mother to lead it, but if that was the case, then why not just take the animal that was broke? That doesn't make much sense.
Okay. Let's see. Could we talk about Isaiah 53, since
Sure.
I spent the opening statement dealing with that? What do you see to be the referent of Isaiah 53? What's your position on that?
So you admit that Jesus is a priest, but Jesus does not come from the tribe of Levi, so he can't be a high priest. It says there that nobody but those from the tribe of Levi can go into the Holy of Holies without dying, or into the sanctuary without dying, or approach the altar. Maybe, I'm sorry.
Okay, so to answer the question, who do you see the referent of Isaiah 53 being?
I believe that the majority of Isaiah, Isaiah 1, I believe, is probably referring to maybe Isaiah himself. He's portraying himself in the first few chapters, but in particular, Isaiah 53, I believe that it's talking about the people of Israel, and when it uses these what you call personification, whenever it actually gives them a name and a gender and everything. Okay. I believe that's kind of showing a binary there, a worldly side, like a fleshly side, a sinful side, and then the spiritual side, which is the children of Israel.
On that interpretation, how do you square that with the fact that in various texts, including Isaiah 10, Isaiah 29, Zechariah 1, Jeremiah 30, Jeremiah 31, etc., that the nations that God sends against Israel, actually he's using these nations, Assyria, Babylon, etc., to to judge Israel because of Israel's sins, and then he turns his hand in judgment upon those nations for overdoing the punishment. And so how do you square that with the
No. I think what that is, I think at one point it's the people who have committed crimes against the children of Israel, and they're feeling guilty about it. They're feeling I guess apologetic. They're feeling remorseful, I guess would be a good word.
Mm-hmm. So how does that bring healing to the other nations?
How does that what?
How does that bring healing and justification to the other nations?
Oh, I have no idea.
So that's what Isaiah 53 is talking about. It says that he was cursed for he was cursed for our transgressions.
Well, it says that God will do that, and in fact, give me 1 second. I'm sorry. In Isaiah, I'm sorry, not in Isaiah. What am I thinking? In sorry. Okay, in Jeremiah 31, he talked about verses 31 through 34 when it talks about this new covenant with the house of Israel. This is God. It says that God is putting His law in our minds, and He's writing it on our hearts, and that all will know Him from the least of them to the greatest, and that God will forgive their iniquity and their sin. He will remember no more. So it's saying that God will forgive us of our sins.
Yeah,
but
speaking about Israel,
but it doesn't mention anything about Jesus, doesn't mention anything about having to send Himself, doesn't mention anything about a sacrifice, a suffering servant, or anybody having to die. We're talking about Jeremiah here. I mean, I think that really says something, that there's nothing mentioned about anything messianic.
In that particular text, no, but there are other texts in Jeremiah and, of course, various other passages throughout Scripture that do.
Yes, but not in this particular context.
Not in that particular text, but dealing with the forgiveness that's available for everyone. Because, like, for example, if you go to the book of Zechariah 3, and Zechariah chapter 3, and we look at from verses 6 to 10, it says, "And the angel of the Lord solemnly assured Joshua," and Joshua here represents, he looks forward to the Messiah. I can show arguments for that if you want, but Joshua is a foreshadow of the Messiah. Verse 7, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, if you will walk in my ways and keep my charge, then you shall rule my house and have charge of my courts, and I will give you the right of access among those who stand here. Hear now, O Joshua," and by the way, Joshua or Yeshua is the same name as Jesus, essentially. "O Joshua, the high priest, you and your friends who sit before you, for they are men who are a sign." In other words, they foreshadow something. "Behold, I will bring my servant the branch," two messianic titles. "For behold, on the stone that I have set before Joshua, on a single stone with 7 eyes, I will engrave its inscription." And of course, the 7 eyes, and I can show this if you want, reveals the omnipresence and omniscience of God. Declares the Lord.
Whose question time is it? I forgot.
It's my question time.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
It declares the Lord of
Just
hosts.
ran out. So sorry about that.
So sorry, Joe. I'm sorry, man.
We will.
You can go ahead and finish. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'll just finish quickly reading this verse, and I'll pass over. "For behold, in the stone I have set before Joshua, on a single stone with 7 eyes, I will engrave an inscription, declares the Lord of hosts, and I will remove the iniquity of this land in a single day." And so that pertains to that, and it's in a messianic context. There's lots of other texts I could cite, but I'll yield the time for your cross-examination.
Gotcha. We will next go over to the cross-exam, where Jim will be asking questions to Jonathan. So I have to say, this has honestly been one of the more, I've just enjoyed this debate thoroughly so far, and I'm confident I'll enjoy the rest. I enjoy all the debates on here to some degree, but this one's especially been interesting. So, all right, anyway, back to it. So Jim, the floor is yours, and I'll start the timer on your first word.
Okay. What is you said that that Isaiah 53, that interpretation, your interpretation, I'm sorry, that my interpretation is a modern text, a modern development. Is that correct?
It's largely, yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, okay. Can you tell me what the earliest mention of that is?
Of it being national Israel?
Yes.
I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what the earliest one is.
Okay, well, do you know that like the earliest written Targumim or Targums, however you want to say it. The earliest written ones actually have my interpretation of it being the children of Israel, and in fact, the Septuagint translation vehemently goes out of its way to pound in the fact that it is very much the children of Israel that it's representing.
I can give you many references from ancient Judaism where the servant of Isaiah 53 is identified as Messiah. I can give you, for example, the Targum of Jonathan ben Uzziel from the 1st century, which is an Aramaic Targum, a Jewish source, which identifies it as a Messiah. And there's quite a number of other references as well, which for example, this is from the Targum of Jonathan ben Uzziel. He says, "Behold, my servant Messiah shall prosper. He shall be high and increase and be exceeding strong. As the house of Israel looked to him through many days, because their countenance was darkened among the peoples, and their complexion beyond the sons of men." We find the same interpretation in the Babylonian Talmud. It says the Messiah. What is his name? It says this is Sanhedrin 98b. It says the rabbis say the leprous one, those of the house of Rabbi say the sick one, as it is said, surely he has borne our sicknesses. Of course, quoting from Isaiah 53.
Are you aware that first century Targum also put some of those as being Moshe or Moses?
Yeah, I'm aware that, of course, that source doesn't consider Jesus to be the fulfillment of Isaiah 53. Yeah.
Okay, so, but what I'm saying is, like, you think that it's sufficient evidence that he says that it's talking about the Messiah when he goes right back into another spot in Isaiah that you think refers to the Messiah, and he thinks that it's Moses. Would you agree with him there?
So I don't agree with this interpretation of Isaiah 53, but I'm only pointing out that the messianic interpretation is not my invention or a new invention, but it's something that goes right back into.
Of course. But I mean, just because it's not a new invention doesn't mean it's the right invention. I mean, we can just as easily say that it's talking about Moses and leave it at that, and say
exactly. That's why I argue
Messiah and wipe our hands and walk away.
So that's why I argue that, and you'll notice actually in my opening statement, I argued exclusively on the basis of exegesis of the text, using intra-biblical evidence, using just the book of Isaiah primarily, as well as reference to Zechariah, to argue, to build a cumulative case for the identity of the servant from Isaiah 53. I didn't even use any external sources in my opening statement. So I'm not appealing to authority, I'm appealing to arguments.
Right. But what I'm saying is you're cherry picking the arguments. Like, you're only agreeing with him and only using him as a valid source because he agrees with you there. I mean, that's like, using Origen for your arguments, or using Marcion for your arguments, or Tertullian, or any of that. Yeah. People who are alleged to have heretical beliefs. I mean, it's all just about popular opinion. I wish people would see that. Okay.
Just very quickly, just to respond to that. You have 2 minutes.
Okay.
But just on that very quickly, I did not build my argument based on the Targum of Jonathan ben Uzziel or any of the other midrashic sources of the Talmud or anything else. I built my argument in my opening statement just based on the actual text itself.
In one of your arguments, you compared Isaiah 6 to Isaiah 53. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, and actually, it's no coincidence, I think, that John 12 just puts the two together when he quotes from both of them together in John 12. If you look at Isaiah 52:13, it says, "My servant shall be high and lifted up and shall be exalted." In Isaiah 6, it uses the same exaltation language, which applies it to Yahweh. In the year King Uzziah, so the Lord sitting upon the throne high and exalted, the train of Israel filled the temple.
Are you aware that these two individual passages are written by completely different authors, hundreds of years apart?
I would contest that, but it's a long discussion and it's not subject to this debate.
Can you give me like a quick elevator speech?
No, because it's off topic.
Fair enough.
And it would take me a while to develop my case, and I don't have time just now.
Okay.
If you want to debate that on a future occasion, I'd be happy to, because I do have material to talk about on that.
All right. I guess that's all I got.
Okay.
You got it. Thank you very much. And this has been lively and interesting. We will next go on to the 5-minute closing. So I will set the clock up. And then remember, if you have a question, put it in the live chat, and it makes it a little bit easier for me to spot it if you put @ModernDayDebate at the start. And then you can let us know who that question is for, or it could be for both of the speakers. So With that, the timer is set, and on your first word, Jonathan.
You said 5 minutes, didn't you?
That's right.
Okay. Well, thank you again to Jim for participating in this debate. I have much enjoyed this spirited discussion. You'll recall in my opening statement that I presented one major text as evidence for the messianic credentials of Jesus being rooted in the Old Testament, namely Isaiah 52:13 through Isaiah 53:12, which deals with the suffering servant. I argued from multiple lines of evidence cumulatively that the identity of the suffering servant is a divine person, who is both human yet divine, that he serves in a priestly capacity. The sacrifice that he has to offer is his own body himself. He turns out to be one who dies and pays the penalty for the sins of the people, that he actually undergoes death, that he bears the just, righteous wrath of God against sin for all of those who will place their trust in him, and we find tremendous evidence in that text in Isaiah 53 that points to Christ. And of course, if you read the text, it looks like you're reading something from the New Testament, because it's so clearly about the mission of Jesus of Nazareth, the Messiah. And so it would encourage viewers, if you haven't studied Isaiah 53, delve into it into more detail. There's much more detail that we could discuss than what I've had time to in the course of this debate presentation. And so I just want to just summarize some of the things that Jim has brought up and why I think they're problematic. He brought up a number of New Testament issues, which I showed were flawed, especially the likes of bringing up Matthew 21, the alleged two animals, and Hosea 11:1 just shows a misunderstanding of how Matthew's using the Old Testament. Mark 13:30 about the generation will not pass away until these things have happened. Again, just not reading it contextually, as I would suggest that we should. And also, in his reading of the Old Testament, there are a number of problems in my opponent's presentation, such as conflating the first and second advent of the Messiah, and so on. Yes, the Messiah is to accomplish certain things which have not yet been fulfilled, but these are yet future. And because we have the first delivery of the Messiah given as scheduled, we can then trust and have confidence that the second delivery will also come as prophesied as well. And so I would like to point viewers, including my opponent this evening, to the gospel as elaborated in the scriptures, as foreshadowed in the Old Testament, and of course the scriptures in their totality find their culmination and climax in the gospel, namely the incarnation of God's Son and the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, the death of God's Son on the cross. The second person of the triune Godhead, who's himself fully God, took upon himself a second nature, becoming flesh. And because of his great love for us, having lived a perfect life, having lived a life of sinless perfection, living every single moment of his life perfect before a just and holy and righteous God, he went to the cross of Calvary. And on that cross, he bore the sins of God's people. He became literally accursed for you and for me, so that those sins that we've committed, those crimes against a holy and just and righteous God that we have committed, can be pardoned, that we can be acquitted before a just and righteous God. That cup of divine fury, of divine wrath, of which we read in the Old Testament, was handed not to us as it should have been, as was our just deserts, but handed instead to Christ. For all those who trust in Christ, there is hope of salvation, confidence, certain assurance of salvation, and we get to spend eternity of fellowship with God, our Maker. And so, by trusting in Christ and by throwing ourselves at the foot of the cross, repenting of our sin, turning from our sin, and placing our faith solely in what Christ has done, ceasing to trust our own goodness, our own meritorious deeds, because our own deeds, of course, cannot wipe away our sin. It's like standing before a judge in a court of law and saying, Your Honor, yes, I committed the crime as charged, but, I washed your car this morning, or I donated to a charity. Our good deeds are not sufficient to wash away our sins. Only trusting in Christ and his finished work upon the cross can avail to cover our sin. For when he cried out from the cross, it is accomplished, it is finished, tetelestai in Aramaic. It is as though he turned over that cup of divine fury, and not one drop had fell out, for he had consumed it right down to the very last drop. So that if we trust in Christ alone and repent of our sins, we can enjoy eternity of fellowship with him. And so I ask you, what will you do with this Jesus that we read of in both the Old and New Testaments? Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and just in time. So, Jim, looking forward to your closing as well. I've got the timer set for 5 minutes, and I will start it on your first word.
All right. I mean, I think I made a pretty convincing argument. I mean, I pointed out that Jesus is not a high priest nor Levite, and according to Numbers 2, anybody who approaches the sanctuary that is not a son of Aaron, that is not of the tribe of Levi, that they will be put to death. So we know that that's not it. And the Lord said to Moses, who said to the priest, said that the Lord will raise up for them a prophet like them from among them. So we know that Jesus is not the Messiah. It's not who Isaiah is referencing, whether in first Isaiah or second Isaiah or third Isaiah. I'm still not sure if I believe in third Isaiah yet. I'm still doing a lot of research into that. But it definitely has at least two authors. It's not who he's referring to in 53 for sure. We can definitely see there that it's talking about the nation of Israel, and it's using Jacob when it uses personification to show not the humanity, but the flawed side of them, their flesh side. Jesus wasn't born of a virgin, nor was it necessary for him to be born of a virgin. And I just want to touch on something that my opponent said. He said that when Matthew is talking about out of Egypt do I call my son, Hosea 11:1, he said something really interesting. He said that it was Matthew's misunderstanding of the Old Testament. Now, I just want everybody to pause on that for a second and just think about the implications of his words just now. Matthew's misunderstanding of the Old Testament. Matthew is the only gospel author who was an eyewitness to Jesus, to any of his accounts, especially to his triumphant entry to Jerusalem, which was most likely him standing on the donkeys with a sword, waving like a crazy person, like most apocalyptic preachers. But no, seriously. But Matthew's misunderstanding of the Old Testament. Why would he be misunderstanding something that he was there for? Why would he be adding things to it? It says in the Old Testament that anybody who adds or takes away from the word is not sent from God. That is not the Lord's word. I really think that's it. I mean, that's drops mic. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And we will now move into the question and answer period. So if you have questions, just a reminder, feel free to put them into the live chat, and you can start them with @ Modern Day Debate so that we can spot them. And first up, we have the Shepherd's Ambassador asks, what about after the order of Melchizedek? I'm not super sure what they mean or who it's for. Maybe it seems like the debaters usually know better than I do. Do you know what they might be referring to?
Yeah. So basically, I think it's to do with the fact that Melchizedek was not of the tribe of Levi because Levi hadn't been born yet when Abraham met Melchizedek in Genesis 14. I think that's what he's getting at.
Well, it also says that nobody can be a priest except for the sons of Levi or the ones the Lord appoints.
Right, and Melchizedek is described as priest of God Most High, and the Messiah is said in Psalm 110 to be a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, and so he's a special. He's not a priesthood after the order of Levi. Christ is not a priest after the order of Levi. He's a priest after the order of Melchizedek. So I mean, there's the Hebrews makes the point that Melchizedek is a greater priesthood than that of Levi for a few reasons. One is that Abraham tithes to Melchizedek, and of course Levi it's still in the loins of his ancestor, and so it's as though Levi himself is tithing to Melchizedek, and so Melchizedek's the greater priesthood, and so forth. So there's a lot of really interesting symbolism.
I mean, don't you think that's like a lot of gymnastics? That's a lot of flipping.
No, I mean, it's Psalm 110 is clear that the Messiah will, and I can show this. Psalm 110 is a messianic psalm if you want, but Psalm 110.
Right. But if you're quoting from a source, like if you're quoting from Deuteronomy, you're quoting from Numbers, you're obviously talking about that particular context. And if they're sitting there talking about that you can only be from the tribe of Levi to be a high priest, then I mean you can't really just insert your own your own exegesis into it. Well, eisegesis actually.
Yeah, I mean, Christ isn't a high priest in the same sense that the priests of Levi were priests. He's a priest of a different order, right? He's not going into the temple, year after year presenting new sacrifices, because he presents a once for all perfect sacrifice.
Right. That's not a high priest.
Sorry.
That's not a high priest, and it says that the Messiah will be exalted. He will be exalted above the priest, above the angels, to the heavens.
Yeah, exactly. So what's your point?
So what I'm saying is he was definitely at least a high priest.
Yeah, exactly.
But what you're talking about isn't a high priest. He wasn't approaching the altar. He wasn't going into the Holy of Holies.
The high priest. The high priest.
It's from a different order, right? Just like you said, he doesn't have those privileges because he's not a high priest, because he's not of the tribe of Levi.
Okay. Again, we're talking past each other. I think Psalm 110 indicates, and this is a concept that's brought out in the New Testament, that is a priest of a different order from that of Levi. And there's certain key differences.
I got you. I see what you're saying. So do you think that explains the change in genealogy, or never mind. It's not my question time.
Okay.
We have another question, and this comes from Praise I Am That I Am. He asks, "What is your synopsis of the crucifixion of Jesus, written 1,000 years beforehand in Psalms 22?" I guess that's for Jim.
It wasn't. That is a song attributed to David, I believe, sung to a musician, I believe is who it was written for. It wasn't designed to be anything prophetic. People feel the need to take the Psalms as prophetic, but really they were just songs. There were songs to tell about somebody who was feeling surrounded, about somebody who felt there was no way out. In fact, if it's the same one I'm thinking about, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I think it's talking about the dog circling you and biting at you and piercing you. It's not talking about a crucifixion at all. I mean, if you can point out any clear sign that it is talking about a crucifixion, I'd be happy to hear it.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And if we look at Psalm 22, which of course Jesus quotes from on the cross when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" to try and draw it to people's attention that this psalm is being fulfilled in their presence. If we just break in, just
no, that's post hoc. That's retrofitting. That's writing. That's much like what Matthew did when Matthew was talking about Hosea. Just like you said, misunderstanding the Old Testament, calling something prophecy that wasn't originally prophecy.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
If you were sorry if you were already done, Jonathan. I just wanted to hear what you were going to say in case you weren't done.
Yeah, I've just got a few comments. If we look at Psalm 22 internally, I think it is actually prophetic. I think it is messianic. If obviously I don't have time to do justice to this, I'm trying to be brief. But if people want to do deep dive on this, I recommend Dr. Michael Brown's book. He's done a series of books called Answering Jewish Objections to Jesus. The Messianic Prophecy volume, which I think is volume 3, has a really great section of Psalm 22, which I highly recommend reading. If we look at from verse 12, just for brevity, many bulls encompass me, strong bulls of Bashan surround me. And so there's this idea of these political rulers and high authorities surround me. they open wide their mouths at me like a ravening and roaring lion. So you see these metaphors of these animals. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. And of course, the crucifixion victims' bones become disjointed. My heart is like wax; it is melted within my breast. Which again is very fitting with the crucifixion victim who ultimately dies by asphyxiation.
But
let me finish before you break. Let me just finish. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death, and so of course dehydration is also associated with crucifixion. For dogs encompass me, a band of evildoers encircles me, and of course the crucifixion would be a very public spectacle with onlookers and so forth. They have pierced my hands and my feet. And of course that is very fitting with the crucifixion scene. I can count all my bones, very consistent again. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots, which is also very consistent with the Roman crucifixion, and so forth. And I'll just stop there for brevity, but there's a lot more that could be said on this, and I think it points to the reality of a crucifixion scene, which wasn't even crucifixion as a mode of execution was not even invented when this psalm was written. Sorry, go ahead, Jim. You had a point?
I mean, just, when you're saying, that this could be this and it could be that, and it sounds like this might be this, and the dog circling him, it was a public spectacle. I mean, you could say that it was somebody who was in the stocks or whatever, and or somebody who I don't know, who got stuck or something like that. I mean, it's and who literally had dogs surrounding them. I mean, when he's talking about dogs, he's talking about the people who are oppressing them and closing in on them. They can feel like there's something about to happen. So it hasn't quite happened yet. It hasn't popped off, but they know that something is about to happen. And that's what this song is. This song is a song of encouragement. It's a song of people to prepare people for things to come.
The ancient readers actually recognized that this doesn't seem to fit any event in David's life, and so the messianic there is actually a chain of
I don't believe it was written by Daniel, but I don't believe many of the things that were attributed to Daniel are written by Daniel.
Oh, I wasn't talking about Daniel. Sorry, did I say Daniel? If I said it's Daniel, I misspoke. Sorry, David. There's nothing in David's life which parallels this narrative, this scene, and so the ancients recognized this, and there's actually some witnesses that view it as a messianic text. But let's move on to the next question.
You bet. Next up, we have Estevado Mexicano. Thanks for your question.
That's a cool name.
They ask, do you believe...
I think it's Estevato.
Estevato, thank you very much. They ask, do you believe, this is for Jim, do you believe that the Old Testament prophecies are, quote-unquote, prophecies? If Jesus didn't fulfill ancient prophecy, is there someone who will, or were those writings simply not prophetic?
Is that to me?
Yes.
No, I don't. I'm not Jewish. I don't believe in prophecy. I don't believe that is an ability. I don't believe anybody can seer, or I don't believe that the gift of prophecy has returned, like Peter said when he said that he was standing before the crowd in the 11 on the day of Pentecost when he received the gift of tongues, and he said this is a sign of things that was prophesied in Joel, and said that God will pour his spirit upon his people and give the children of Israel the gift of prophecy again. And so supposedly for the past 2,000 years, Jews are mind readers. But I don't see that happening. But to answer your question, no, I don't believe that.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Next, Nicholas Wheeler asks for Jim, if John 2:21 mentions Jesus was talking about his body after the fact the temple was destroyed, why didn't the disciples mention that destruction?
Well, because it hadn't been destroyed. He was saying that I will. It's not saying that I have.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Next up, Estevato Mexicano. Another question for Jim. They ask, can't a historical text be interpreted allegorically while retaining its literal meaning? If so, couldn't a text be reasonably interpreted to support Jesus's messiahship?
I think he's trying to say that if I think that it's possible it's a dual prophecy, while it can mean what it's meaning literally, like the prophecy in Isaiah with the King Ahaz and the virgin birth, that it was meaning both King Ahaz's wife or girlfriend or what midwife or whatever, and the future Messiah, then no. I think that's just apologetics. I mean, I think that either you're going to accept it one way or you're not. You can't take something out of context and cherry pick what you're going to accept allegorically and what you're going to interpret literally, and you can't take it as both just because it's convenient.
By the way, I disagree with the dual interpretation of Isaiah 7:14. I think its primary referent is the Messiah.
Oh man, I almost agreed with you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm tempted to go into this, but I've got a lot of material on Isaiah 7, so I probably would spend longer than I should.
That's right. We can chat about it later.
Yeah,
you got it. We have another question, and it's Praise I Am That I Am asks. This is like one of the very few times we have more questions for the atheist than the Christian. They ask, what about Psalm 16, where it says the Holy One was resurrected?
Is this a question for me?
I'm not sure. I think it's for Jim.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can read it.
It also says that donkeys talk. It also says that snakes talk. I mean, there's you can say, what about, and then say something, what about Jesus walking on the water? What about this? I mean, when it all boils down to it, you weren't there, I wasn't there. The only thing that we have to go off of are these accounts, and whenever there are multiple attestations and they are conflicting or confusing attestations, written decades after the fact, sometimes hundreds of years after the fact, and they attempt to dishonestly go back and seem like they were there, like in Daniel. Yeah, I think that's about all I got to say about that.
Gotcha. Then we have one from Epic Christ, who asks, the Shroud of Turin, if the Shroud of Turin proves resurrection, then why don't you believe in resurrection? I'm sure.
I'm sure that's for me, but what was the question?
It was just, it says question and then colon, and then it says Shroud of Turin proves resurrection, then why don't you believe in resurrection?
No, it doesn't prove the resurrection. It's been verifiably dated back to the I believe it's between the 13th and 15th century. It's a fake. It's a known fake. As a matter of fact, it's been tampered with several times as an attempt to make it appear more authentic. But no, it's a complete fake. The blood flow patterns, the imprint patterns, the method itself, that's not even how they would dress their dead. They would actually wrap their dead mummy style with layers of spices in between. They wouldn't just have them going up and down the back of it. That was a much later understanding of it. They weren't aware of that. But
and just very quickly, this isn't my field of expertise at all, so I'm not going to weigh in on it myself. But there is another side to this, and if people want to see the other side, then go and view Gary Habermas's material on the Shroud of Turin. He presents the case that it is in fact authentic, but it is never part of my case for the resurrection. It's not my expertise either, so I never really covered that material.
Gotcha. And for this portion of the Q&A, if there are any other questions, let me know. I think we maybe have one or two more. Otherwise, obviously, we'll take more because we do have a little bit more time. Nicholas, forgive me. I want to make sure that I actually asked Nicholas Wheeler's question. So thanks for that question, Nicholas, as well as everybody else's questions. And otherwise, I think what we could do is if you guys had a particular point of issue during the debate that you thought you wanted to hash out yet, that would be this would be a good opportunity as we wait for any other questions that might come in.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we could go into Isaiah 7 if you want.
I mean, if you think you got time, I mean, it's
sure. I mean, I can make a start on it.
Okay.
So let me just try and explain the background a little bit. Isaiah 7 from verse 1. In the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, son of Uzziah, king of Judah, Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, the king of Israel, came up to Jerusalem to wage war against it, but could not yet mount an attack against it. When the house of David was told Syria is in league with Ephraim, Ephraim, of course, is the northern kingdom of Israel. This is why in Israel is a divided kingdom. You have the kingdom of Judah, and you have the northern kingdom of Israel. The heart of Ahaz, he's the king of Judah, and the heart of his people stood as the trees of the forest shake before the wind. So basically the idea is that Assyria is threatening to invade both Judah and the northern kingdom, or Ephraim, and so Syria and Syria is also under threat. So Syria and the northern kingdom have formed an anti-Assyrian alliance and have asked King Ahaz of Judah to join them in this alliance, and of course Ahaz refuses to join, and it says, verse 3, the Lord said to Isaiah, go out to meet Ahaz, you and Shear-Jashub, and the son's name means a remnant shall return, your son at the end of at the end of the conduit of the upper pool on the highway to the water's field, and say to him, be careful, be quiet, do not fear, and do not let your heart be faint because of these two smoldering stumps of firebrands of the fierce anger of Rezin, Syria, and the son of Remaliah, because Syria with Ephraim and the son of Remaliah has devised evil against you, saying, let us go up against Judah and terrify it, and let us conquer it for ourselves, and set up the son of Tabeel as king in the midst of it. So they basically are wanting to overthrow the king of Judah, namely Ahaz, and instead this other king as a replacement. And of course, this threatens to overthrow the Davidic dynasty and thus put an end to the messianic line. Of course, the Messiah is supposed to come from the house of David. Thus says the Lord God. And so God's not going to let this happen. He's going to protect the house of David. It shall not stand, and it shall not come to pass. For the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. And within 65 years, Ephraim will be shattered from being a people. And the people of Ephraim in Samaria, and the head of Samaria is the son of Remaliah. If you are not firm in faith, you will not be firm at all. So the condition of God's salvation is faith, that they have to place their faith. Otherwise, that's the condition of the promise. So verse 10. Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz, ask a sign of the Lord your God, let it be deep as Sheol or high as heaven. And of course, this is an occasion where God offers some evidence for his promises, because God is a God of evidence. In verse 12, the Ahaz said, he pretends to be pious, I will not ask and not put the Lord to the test. And he said, hear then, O house of David. So now the God is now changing the subject of his speech from Ahaz to the entire house of David, because the yous here and the pronouns are in the plural in Hebrew. So he's speaking to the house of David in its entirety. Hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you, plural you, to weary man, that you weary my God also? Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. So now it's going to be a sign not of Ahaz's choosing, but of God's choosing. And the sign is a sign not to Ahaz, but to the entire house of David. Because the you there, behold, the Lord himself will give you a sign.
No. The sign is to Ahaz, because it says, so that you will believe that it's true.
Which verse are you talking about?
So at first, Ahaz is refusing the prophecy for Isaiah. He was like, why don't you ask for a sign from God? And Ahaz is like, no, like I don't want to. And he was like, just do it. Just ask for a sign. So finally, he asked for a sign, and he, when he gets to the sign, he says that you'll receive this sign so that you will believe. Yeah. So in his lifetime, so that he may believe. So what is the point in it being Jesus if he already? How would he believe? He's been dead for a long time.
So I'm not finished making this case. So okay. So Ahaz was offered to ask a sign. Ahaz refused because he pretends to be pious, and so God then says, well, he's going to offer a sign to the house of David, and the yous there are in their plural, and he says, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign, plural. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. He shall eat curds and honey, meaning that he's to be born to the poverty of his people. So basically, what I understand this verse to be saying is that God's plan of sending the Messiah through the Davidic line is still on schedule. It's still on track. So don't worry about this. He says, he shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the boy, and I actually understand there being two boys here, because there's the Emmanuel child, and then there's the boy that Isaiah was instructed to bring with him to meet Ahaz earlier on in the chapter. Namely, the son who's Shear-Jashub, meaning a remnant shall return. And so in the midst of judgment, they're going to be sent into exile. There's a promise of restoration. And then I could continue in chapter 7, but when you get to chapter 8, there's actually a child born to Isaiah called Maher-shalal Hashbaz, which is a name of judgment, basically. It means hasten to the spoil or hurry to the plunder. And it says in verse 3, I went to the prophetess, and she conceived and bore a son. Then the Lord said to me, call his name Maher-shalal Hashbaz, for before the boy knows how to cry my father or my mother, the wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be carried away before the king of Assyria. Now I would contend this is not the Emmanuel child. This is a different child. And in fact, Judah is not spared from the Assyrian invasion, because it says that not only is Syria and Ephraim taken out, but also that the wrath of God will spill over its banks and flow into Judah as well, because of Ahaz's unbelief.
But when it says that you will call him Emmanuel, it's talking about a woman who has possibly already conceived a child and is very much talking to Ahaz. Talking directly to Ahaz.
What? How do you know that the woman's already conceived? That's not at all.
No. I didn't. I'm not saying that definitively. I'm saying that it is ambiguous. That it could possibly mean that, like the grammar and the syntax of that particular passage is it's really difficult to determine. But basically, it can go one of either way.
So leaving aside for the moment the question of the translation of virgin and whether she would already a virgin,
Not that, but okay.
So there's three children in view in these two chapters. There's Maher-shalal Hashbaz, and then there's Emmanuel, and then there's Shear-Jashub. And then in chapter 9, I would argue that the Emmanuel child from Isaiah 7 is inextricable from the child that's spoken of in Isaiah 9. And Isaiah 9 certainly is speaking about the Messiah, because he's born as a descendant of David, in the heir of David. He's called Emmanuel in Isaiah 7. Isaiah 8, in fact, it says in verse 8, speaking about God's wrath in the form of Assyria, says it will sweep over on into Judah, it will overflow and pass on, reaching even to the neck, and its outspread wings will fill the breadth of your land, possessive of Emmanuel, suggesting...
those are already his two sons that he already has. Okay, Emmanuel is the third son prophesied, because the names of the other two sons are very doom and gloom, and this one is supposed to mean God is with us. It's supposed to give the people hope, because King Ahaz, just thinks that he's screwed either way. He doesn't want to group up with the other guys because he thinks that they're going to lose anyway. And Isaiah just asked for a sign. He asked for a sign. The sign was he would have a third child, whether from it most likely wasn't from his wife, but it could be. If you want to say that it's a virgin, you could say that it was another wife of his. At the time, it was not frowned upon. But it most certainly could have been his wife. She still could have been a young woman of childbearing age.
I want to just since we have been alternating, I want to give Jim the last word before we go to just a few last questions before we wrap up, if that's okay with you guys.
Okay, sure.
You can go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Okay, gotcha. Sorry, I thought I misunderstood. Epic Christ asks, will Jim debate me regarding the Shroud of Turin? It's been going on.
No, that dude's crazy.
So sorry, Epic Christ. But next up, Praise I Am That I Am asks, what about Zechariah 12:10, where God says they crucified me?
It doesn't say that. It says they will look upon me whom they have pierced. That's what he's talking about.
Gotcha. And then let's see. Leslie Lockhart asks, Jim, why in Hebrews 7 verses 11 and 12, why is there a change in priesthood from the Levitical to that of Melchizedek? Perfection comes through Christ's priesthood.
Right. Well, and that's because when Jesus died in Matthew 27, he let out a loud yell, and there's a great earthquake, and the temple veil split in two, and that signified a breaking of the veil, meaning that the Holy of Holies and the altar was not limited to just the high priest anymore. This when and then the graves opened, the bodies of the saints rose, and they went walking around, shaking hands and kissing babies.
Gotcha. By the way, we're closing the Q&A intake. We got a lot of great questions, but just to make sure that we try to respect the debaters' time as much as possible, we got to speed through. Estevato Mexicano, thanks for your question. He asked Jim, how do you make your mustache look so smooth?
To be honest, like I don't do much to it. I wax it like once a week, maybe twice a week.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. And then Ald, forgive me if I mispronounce this, Ald Lang Sin asked, why is it that almost all Jesus did is taken from the Old Testament? There doesn't seem to be any historical memory.
Right, sure. Right. Like for instance, the instance in Matthew with Matthew's account of the colt and the donkey. You know, he's referring on Old Testament prophecy and quoting it verbatim for an account that he was there for, supposedly.
Gotcha. And then Praise I Am That I Am asks, how can Jim say there is no Jewish prophecy of the Messiah not being Jesus when Isaiah 9:6 says the mighty God and everlasting Father would be born?
I'm sorry, what was that?
They asked, how can Jim say there is no Jewish prophecy of the Messiah not being Jesus? Or I think they mean, how can Jim say there is no Jewish prophecy of the Messiah being Jesus when Isaiah 9:6 says the mighty God and everlasting Father would be born?
Okay, like that's one verse. Like you have to, you can't cherry pick verses. Take the numbers out and then tell me something. Like if you were to take a sentence out of Black Beauty and say this is what Black Beauty is about because of this sentence right here, like that's dishonest. You have to take it in its entire context.
Gotcha. Thank you very much, both debaters. We appreciate you coming on here. It's been a true joy. And we want to say thanks so much to everybody out there who has been asking questions during the debate and the Q&A. And so just want to remind you, you will have, you'll have access to the debaters' links in the description. And we highly encourage you to check them out because if you like them, great, you can hear more. And if you're like, oh, no, I just can't stand it, well, you know what? They'll grow on you. Once you check them out, you'll be like, hey, you know what? I actually like that. So I highly encourage you to hop onto their links, check out what they have. And with that, debaters, any last words? Thanks for coming on.
Well, thanks for hosting the debate, and thanks, Jim, for participating, and thanks you, the audience, for joining and participating in the live chat and submitting your questions as well.
Thanks.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll definitely second that, and thank you so much, Jonathan, for that, and James for hosting, and looking forward to the next one.
Mm-hmm.
You betcha. Well, thanks, everybody. Keep sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable. And as mentioned, tomorrow, Inspiring Philosophy will be here debating whether or not Easter has pagan origins with a neo-pagan. So that'll be definitely interesting. And hope you all have a great day or night, whatever time zone you're in. Take care.
Bye.